Everyone knows Atlantis, the lost continent, the ancient civilization, gone in a single night. Here's the part nobody talks about. We know exactly who invented it, when, and why. And it has nothing to do with a lost civilization. So why are people still searching for it? That is exactly what we are going to find out. Atlantis was invented by one man. His name was Plato, Greek philosopher, 4th century before our era, one of the most influential thinkers in human history. The man whose ideas about politics, justice, and the nature of reality are still discussed in universities today. He also made up a story about a magical island that has been confusing people for 2,000 years. Here is how it went. Plato wrote 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. A dialogue was a specific form of ancient Greek writing where characters sit around and discuss ideas. Think of it as philosophy disguised as conversation. In these dialogues, a character named Critias tells a story he claims to have heard from his grandfather. Who heard it from the Athenian statesman Solon? Who heard it from Egyptian priests during a visit to Egypt roughly 200 years earlier? That is already 4 layers of second-hand information before we even get to the story itself. The priests told Solon something remarkable. 9,000 years before their conversation, 11,000 years before our time, there existed a great island in the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the boundary of the known world for ancient Greeks. The island was called Atlantis. It started simply enough. There was a mountain on the island. On the mountain lived a girl named Cleito. Poseidon noticed her. And because this was ancient Greek mythology and Poseidon was Poseidon, he decided that her consent was not a necessary part of the arrangement. From this encounter came 5 pairs of twins. The eldest was Atlas. Poseidon gave him the entire island, named it after him. Thus, Atlantis. What followed was everything a philosopher could dream of. The island was paradise. Every grain, every vegetable, every fruit imaginable grew there. The mountains produced minerals and gold and iron in abundance. The kings of Atlantis accumulated wealth that no ruler on earth had ever matched. And they governed wisely. As long as they retained the blood of Poseidon, they ruled with justice and restraint. The citizens had everything they needed. Envy was unknown because there was nothing to envy. Everyone had enough. The state was structured perfectly. A king at the top. Below him, priests and warriors who received land in exchange for service. Below them, craftsmen, farmers, and shepherds who supplied everything the upper classes needed. Clean, efficient, stable. For generations, it worked. Then the divine blood thinned. The kings began to intermarry with ordinary mortals. Slowly, the divine wisdom drained away. The rulers became ambitious, greedy, corrupt. They looked outward and decided that ruling one island was not enough. They invaded. Their armies swept across the Mediterranean. They controlled Spain, parts of Africa. They pushed into Europe. And finally, they turned toward the last free state, Greece, specifically Athens, which, and this is worth noting, was the home city of Plato himself. The Athenians stood alone and fought back. They defeated the Atlantean army, freed the conquered territories, prepared to push forward and finish the job completely. And then Zeus intervened. The gods had been watching the moral decline of Atlantis with increasing displeasure. The invasion was the final straw. Zeus called a council on Olympus, decided that Atlantis needed to be punished. In a single day and a single night, earthquakes struck. The ocean rose. The entire island sank beneath the waves. Gone. Where Atlantis had been only mud and shallow water, remained. A barrier that prevented sailors from crossing westward. The Athenian army that had been advancing toward the island was swallowed by the same catastrophe, which is why, the story concluded, nobody remembered any of this. The survivors had no records. The civilization that had defeated the greatest empire the world had ever seen simply ceased to exist along with its enemy. Only the Egyptian priests preserved the memory, passed it down through their sacred texts, and shared it with Solon when he visited, who told his grandson, who told Plato, who wrote it down. And that is the complete original story of Atlantis. A paradise built on divine blood, a perfect state that decayed through human weakness, a mighty empire that attacked Greece and lost, a catastrophe that erased everything. The story of a civilization that got exactly what it deserved. According to one Greek philosopher who had very specific ideas about what civilizations deserved, here is the question nobody asks. Why would one of the greatest philosophers in history spend time writing about a fictional island? Plato was not a storyteller. He was not writing entertainment. Every word he put on paper had a purpose. Every character, every dialogue, every argument was constructed to make a specific point. So what was the point of Atlantis? To understand that, you need to understand Plato's politics. Plato lived in Athens. Athens was famous for one thing above everything else: democracy. And Plato hated it. Not mildly, not with some reservations, with the deep philosophical conviction of someone who had watched democracy destroy everything he cared about. He had watched Athenian democracy put his mentor, Socrates, on trial, watched a jury of ordinary citizens vote to execute the wisest man he had ever known for the crime of asking too many uncomfortable questions. That experience broke something in Plato's view of popular government. He spent the rest of his life arguing that democracy was not the ideal system people claimed it was, that giving political power to ordinary citizens was like giving a ship's helm to a passenger who had never studied navigation. His alternative was spelled out in his most famous work, The Republic. The ideal state had a philosopher king at the top, someone educated specifically to govern. Below him, a class of warriors who protected the state. Below them, workers and craftsmen who produced what everyone needed. Everyone in their place. Everyone fulfilling their designated role. No elections, no debates, no factions fighting for power. Just a wise ruler making good decisions for everyone. Now look at Atlantis again. A king at the top, priests and warriors below, craftsmen and farmers at the bottom. Everyone supplied with everything they needed. A state where envy was unknown, because the system worked perfectly. It is identical. Plato did not describe Atlantis and then separately propose his ideal state. He described his ideal state and called it Atlantis. The island was a demonstration, a proof of concept. Look, here is what happens when a society is organized correctly. It becomes the most powerful civilization in history. It defeats every enemy. It accumulates wealth beyond imagination. And then look at what happens when the divine order degrades. When rulers start mixing with ordinary people. When the careful hierarchy breaks down. When ambition and greed replace wisdom and restraint. The perfect state collapses, gets swallowed by the ocean, disappears so completely that only Egyptian priests remember it existed. The lesson was aimed directly at Athens. You had something like this once. Ancient Athens, the Athens that defeated Atlantis, was governed by wise leaders, not by popular vote. That Athens was great. Look what you have now. Plato was not writing mythology. He was writing political propaganda. And he was good enough at it that 2,000 years later, people are still taking the propaganda literally. There is one more detail worth noting. The story that Plato tells is conveniently impossible to verify. It happened 9,000 years ago. The only people who knew about it were Egyptian priests. The records they kept have never been found because they were in a civilization that no longer exists. The witnesses are all dead. The island itself is at the bottom of the ocean. A philosopher arguing for a political position conveniently invented a historical example that supported his position perfectly and placed it in a time and location where nobody could check whether it was real. That is not mythology. That is a rhetorical move, a very effective one. Here is something remarkable about the most famous lost civilization in history. For most of history, nobody cared about it. Plato wrote his dialogues in the 4th century before our era. For the next 2,000 years, Atlantis sat in near complete obscurity. Mentioned occasionally, discussed rarely, taken seriously almost never. The first person to push back was Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's most famous student, one of the greatest minds of the ancient world. And he looked at Atlantis and said, "This is not real." His reasoning was simple. The Earth is a sphere. The ocean between Europe and Asia is not infinite. If you sail west from Spain long enough, you will reach land. Not a magical island, just land on the other side. He was right about the shape of the Earth. He was wrong about what the land was. But the important point is that the man who knew Plato personally, who had access to his writings, his lectures, and his private conversations, did not believe Atlantis was real. He thought Plato invented it, and said so. Atlantis also attracted mockery almost immediately. A historian and poet named Theopompus of Chios wrote a story about another magical land called Meropis, a place where people also lived by perfect rules, where cities were enormous and citizens were virtuous, where a different kind of civilization had existed before the known world began. It was a parody. He was making fun of Plato. The fact that someone felt the need to parody Atlantis within Plato's own lifetime suggests that plenty of people at the time understood exactly what it was: a made-up story in service of a philosophical argument. Then Rome absorbed Greek culture. Roman historians occasionally mentioned Atlantis in passing. The writer Marcellinus referenced it as an example of how earthquakes could destroy islands, not as a mystery to be solved, as a geological footnote. The biographer Plutarch wrote about Solon, the statesman who supposedly first heard the story from Egyptian priests. He added details that Plato never included, names of the specific priests, additional context about the conversation. Where Plutarch got this information is unclear. Plato never wrote it, which suggests that even in the ancient world, people were already adding invented details to an invented story. And then, nothing. The medieval period arrived, and Atlantis simply disappeared. For roughly 1,000 years, not a single European writer mentioned it in any meaningful way. The story that would eventually inspire films, games, novels, and genuine scientific expeditions sat completely forgotten in libraries that almost nobody read. This happened for two reasons. First, medieval Europe preferred Aristotle to Plato. The Church had incorporated Aristotelian philosophy into its theology, and Aristotle did not believe in Atlantis. So medieval scholars had no particular reason to take it seriously. Second, Atlantis was a pagan story, involving pagan gods: Poseidon, Zeus, divine bloodlines, and magical islands. The medieval church had limited interest in preserving or promoting stories about the sexual habits of Greek sea deities. So Atlantis waited, sitting in old manuscripts in monastery libraries across Europe, waiting for someone to rediscover it and give it a reason to matter again. Two things happened in the 15th century that changed everything. The first was the Renaissance. Europe rediscovered ancient Greek and Roman texts. Scholars traveled to old libraries and monasteries searching for manuscripts. They translated what they found into Latin, the common language of educated Europeans, and suddenly, ideas that had been sitting unread for centuries were circulating across the continent. A Florentine scholar named Marsilio Ficino found a copy of Plato's dialogues, translated them, published them. Atlantis was back. People read the story, discussed it, debated whether it was real. For the first time in 1,000 years, educated Europeans were taking Plato's lost island seriously. And then the second thing happened. Columbus sailed west. In 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic and found land that no European had known existed. An entire continent, sitting exactly where Plato had said there was nothing but open ocean between Europe and Asia. The effect on European thinking was immediate and enormous. There was land out there. There was an entire world out there that nobody had known about, which meant, if you were a European in 1492, that anything was possible. If a continent could hide undiscovered for thousands of years, then why not a sunken island? If the ocean contained surprises nobody had imagined, then why not Atlantis? The timing was perfect, and the logic was irresistible. America must be Atlantis. Not a new discovery, not an unknown continent, the surviving remnant of the greatest civilization in history. The part of Atlantis that had not sunk beneath the waves. This idea spread with remarkable speed. The evidence seemed to be everywhere. Plato had written that on the site of sunken Atlantis, only mud and shallow water remained. Sailors who crossed the Atlantic reported the Sargasso Sea, a vast area of floating seaweed covering the ocean's surface. Mud and shallow water. Right there, exactly where Plato had described it. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico, they heard that the Aztecs had come from a place called Aztlan, an island, in the water somewhere to the west. Aztlan, Atlantis. Close enough for people who wanted to believe. The fact that Aztlan translated from the Aztec language as Land of the Herons was overlooked. The fact that Aztec legends placed it in a lake rather than an ocean was ignored. The similarity in sound was sufficient. It all fit together. The consequences were not merely academic. A Catholic bishop named Bartolomé de las Casas argued in 1527 that the indigenous people of America were descendants of the Atlanteans. His purpose was humanitarian. The conquest of America was producing horrific violence against native populations. Conquistadors were arguing that indigenous people were not fully human, that they could be killed or enslaved without moral consequence. Las Casas pushed back. These people are descendants of Atlantis, the civilization Plato described as the greatest in history. They're not savages. They are heirs to an ancient tradition that predates anything Europe has produced. He was using a fictional story to make a moral argument, which was, in a strange way, exactly what Plato had done 2,000 years earlier. The Spanish crown went further. King Charles V of Spain declared that the lands of America had belonged to the Spanish crown for thousands of years, that his kingdom was the rightful heir to Atlantis, that God had simply returned to Spain what had always been Spain's. A philosopher's political allegory had become the legal justification for colonial conquest. Plato had written Atlantis to argue for a particular kind of government. 1,500 years later, it was being used to justify the ownership of an entire continent. He would probably have found this either deeply satisfying or deeply horrifying, depending on which part of his philosophy you emphasized. Once Atlantis was back in circulation, everyone wanted a piece of it. Not metaphorically, literally. Country after country began claiming that they were the real Atlantis, that their people were the true descendants of the greatest civilization in history, that Plato had been writing about them all along. It became a competition, and the winner, at least in terms of sheer audacity, was Sweden. In 1679, a Swedish scientist named Olof Rudbeck published the first volume of a work called Atlantica. Rudbeck was not a crank. He was a serious scholar, a biologist who had discovered the lymphatic system in the human body, a man of genuine intellectual achievement. He was also completely convinced that Sweden was Atlantis. His argument went like this. The Baltic Sea had not always looked the way it looked in his time. Sea levels changed, coastlines shifted. What was now underwater had once been dry land. What was now dry land had once been underwater. Therefore, Atlantis could have been in Scandinavia. Therefore, it was. The logic required several enormous leaps, but Rudbeck made them with complete confidence. Sweden was not just the location of Atlantis. Sweden was the origin of all human civilization. The Swedish language was the original language from which all other languages descended. The runes used in ancient Scandinavia were the source of all alphabets everywhere. Swedish people had once ruled Europe as far east as the Volga River and had brought civilization to every people they encountered. The Slavs of Eastern Europe were not Europeans at all, just Asians who had wandered in later. Everything traced back to Sweden. Atlantica ran to 4 volumes. It was enormously popular, not just in Sweden, but across Europe. Isaac Newton personally requested a copy. The Swedes were not alone in this kind of thinking. Italian scholars looked at Plato's text and noticed that the Atlantean Empire had controlled territory in Italy. Therefore, the Italians were descendants of Atlantis. The connection was obvious. Anyone could see it. German scholars proposed the Canary Islands, a volcanic archipelago off the coast of Africa that could plausibly have been larger before geological activity reshaped the region. A Spanish monk suggested that Atlantis was located in the Americas after all, just not the entire continent, a specific region, with specific people who matched Plato's description if you looked at them in the right light. Every theory had evidence. Every theory contradicted every other theory. What was actually happening was something that historians recognize as a pattern in how myths develop. Each generation and each culture takes a story and reshapes it to reflect its own needs and anxieties. Medieval Europe needed Atlantis to connect to biblical history, so it became a variant of the Noah story. Renaissance Spain needed Atlantis to justify colonial expansion, so it became the origin of American civilization. 17th century Sweden needed Atlantis to establish cultural superiority over its neighbors, so it became the birthplace of all human achievement. The story was infinitely flexible, which is precisely why it survived. A rigid myth breaks when the world changes around it. A flexible myth bends, incorporates new information, finds new uses. Atlantis had been a philosophical allegory, then a colonial justification, then a nationalist origin myth, and it was not finished changing yet. The most dramatic transformation was still coming. Everything we have discussed so far was built on Plato. People disagreed about where Atlantis was, about who the Atlanteans were, about which modern nation had the best claim to their legacy. But they were all working from the same source, the same 2 dialogues, the same story about Poseidon and Cleito and the island that sank in a single night. Then one woman threw all of that away and started over. Her name was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Russian by birth, traveler by habit, mystic by profession, and the single most influential person in the history of modern esotericism. Blavatsky claimed to receive her knowledge directly from spiritual masters who communicated with her across vast distances. She did not need libraries. She did not need ancient texts. She did not need Plato. The wisdom of the cosmos came to her directly, and she wrote it down. In 1888, she published her masterwork, The Secret Doctrine, 2 enormous volumes describing the hidden history of humanity, a history that bore almost no resemblance to anything historians recognized, but which was delivered with absolute confidence and extraordinary detail. According to Blavatsky, humanity had not developed gradually from primitive beginnings. Instead, history was organized around 7 root races, 7 great civilizations, each more spiritually advanced than the last, each rising to a peak of development before being destroyed and replaced by the next. The 4th root race was the Atlanteans. They had lived on a continent in the Atlantic Ocean roughly 11,000 years ago, just as Plato had described. Everything else was different. Blavatsky's Atlanteans were not simply a powerful empire with good governance and divine bloodlines. They were beings of extraordinary spiritual development. They possessed psychic abilities that modern humans had entirely lost: telepathy, clairvoyance, the ability to communicate mind to mind across any distance. They also had technology. Not the bronze and iron technology of ancient Greece, something far beyond anything the ancient world had produced. Flying ships powered by a mysterious energy source. Devices that could harness natural forces in ways that modern science could not explain. The Atlanteans had achieved something that human civilization was still struggling toward: a perfect synthesis of spiritual development and technological power. And then they fell. Not because their divine bloodline thinned, not because of political corruption, because they misused their psychic and technological abilities, because they turned their spiritual gifts toward domination and destruction, because power without wisdom destroys everything it touches. The continent sank. The civilization ended. But not all the Atlanteans died. Some escaped. They carried their knowledge with them. They traveled to Egypt, to South America, to India, to every corner of the ancient world where great civilizations would eventually emerge. Everything humanity had ever built was a shadow of what the Atlanteans had achieved. The pyramids of Egypt, the temples of the Maya, the philosophy of ancient Greece, all of it descended from a greater original that had been lost beneath the waves. The Atlantis that Blavatsky invented had almost nothing in common with the Atlantis Plato had written about. Plato's Atlantis was a political allegory about the dangers of moral corruption, a story designed to make an argument about governance. Blavatsky's Atlantis was a spiritual origin story for all of human civilization, a lost golden age of psychic power and advanced technology that explained everything impressive humanity had ever accomplished. Her version was more exciting, and it spread faster. The Atlantis that appeared in novels and films and games throughout the 20th century was almost entirely Blavatsky's invention. The glowing crystal technology, the psychic abilities, the advanced civilization that had somehow achieved things modern science could not explain. None of that came from Plato. All of it came from a Russian mystic who received her information from spiritual masters she communicated with through letters that materialized in a cabinet in her living room. This is where the Disney version of Atlantis came from, the version with the flying machines and the spiritual energy and the people who had evolved beyond ordinary humanity. That is not ancient Greek mythology. That is Helena Blavatsky, dressed up in ancient Greek clothing, and sold to everyone who wanted to believe that humanity had once been greater than it currently was, which, it turns out, is almost everyone. By the 20th century, Atlantis had been many things: a philosophical allegory, a colonial justification, a nationalist origin myth, a spiritual history of the human race. And now, it became something else. A research project, with a budget and uniforms. And a genuine belief that finding Atlantis would change the course of history. The organization was called the Ahnenerbe. It was Heinrich Himmler's personal research division within the SS, the most powerful police and paramilitary organization in Nazi Germany, was funding expeditions to find a mythological island. Himmler was obsessed with the occult in a way that went well beyond casual interest. He believed that the Germanic people were descendants of an ancient master race, a civilization of extraordinary physical and spiritual development that had existed before recorded history. Blavatsky had called them Atlanteans. Himmler called them Aryans. The names were different. The idea was identical. If this original civilization could be found, if its existence could be proven, it would provide historical justification for everything the Nazi regime was doing. The domination of other peoples, the elimination of those deemed inferior, the construction of a new order based on racial hierarchy. It would not be conquest, it would be restoration. The Ahnenerbe sent expeditions to Tibet, to Iceland, to South America, to the Canary Islands, to Scandinavia. Researchers examined cave paintings and ancient ruins and geological formations, looking for evidence of a superior prehistoric civilization. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. But the searching itself was revealing. It showed how completely Plato's story had escaped his control. He had written a political dialogue using a fictional island as an example. 2,000 years later, that fictional island was being used to justify genocide. The gap between what Plato intended and what Atlantis had become was so enormous that it was almost impossible to trace the connection. Meanwhile, science was quietly dismantling the entire foundation that made Atlantis possible. The theory of plate tectonics emerged in the 1960s and became accepted scientific consensus by the end of the 20th century. The Earth's surface is divided into enormous plates. These plates move very slowly, over millions of years. As they move, continents drift, mountains form, oceans open and close. But plates do not sink. A continent cannot simply disappear beneath the ocean the way Plato described. The geology does not allow it. The Atlantic Ocean is several kilometers deep. There is no evidence of any sunken landmass of continental size anywhere in it. The ocean floor has been mapped in extraordinary detail. There is nothing there. Atlantis cannot be in the Atlantic Ocean because the Atlantic Ocean cannot contain a sunken continent. This eliminated most versions of the story simultaneously. The remaining theories moved Atlantis to places where the geology was more cooperative. The volcanic island of Thera in the Aegean Sea, modern Santorini, which did erupt catastrophically around 3,500 years ago. The eruption was enormous. The tsunami it generated devastated the eastern Mediterranean. The Minoan civilization on nearby Crete collapsed within decades. This is a real catastrophe, a real island destroyed by geological forces, real consequences that rippled across the ancient world. Was this Plato's inspiration? Possibly. Probably not directly. The eruption happened roughly 900 years before Plato was born, and the scale is wrong. Thera was a small island, not a continent. The location is wrong. The date is wrong by thousands of years. But it is the closest thing reality offers to what Plato described, and it is enough to explain where the story might have come from without requiring any of the supernatural elements. A volcanic eruption. A civilization collapsed. Stories passed down through generations, getting larger and stranger with each retelling. until a philosopher heard something vague about a catastrophic island disaster a very long time ago and turned it into exactly the story he needed. The search for Atlantis was over. Not because anyone found it, because science had explained why it could not be found. So, Atlantis. Let us be honest about what we just covered. One Greek philosopher wrote a political allegory about an imaginary island to make an argument about governance. The argument was reasonable. The island was fictional. Everyone who knew Plato personally understood this. Then, for 2,000 years, almost nobody cared. Then the Renaissance rediscovered Plato. Columbus found America, and suddenly, a fictional island became the explanation for everything nobody could explain. The origin of indigenous Americans, the justification for colonial conquest, the birthplace of Swedish civilization, the homeland of the Aryan master race, the source of all human spiritual development. A story that started as a philosophical footnote became the most resilient myth in human history. Not because the evidence was convincing. There was no evidence. There has never been any evidence. Because the idea was irresistible. Here is what Atlantis actually is. It is a story about a better world that existed before the one we have now. A civilization that got things right, that built something perfect, and lost it through human weakness and corruption. Every culture in human history has some version of this story. The Greeks had their golden age. The Christians had Eden. The Norse had a time before Ragnarok when gods and humans lived in harmony. The Hindus have their cycles of ages, each one a decline from a more perfect original. The specific details change. The underlying desire is always the same. We want to believe that humanity was once greater than it currently is. That somewhere in the past, there existed a world without the problems that surround us now. That the chaos and injustice and mediocrity of the present is not the natural state of things, but a fall from something better. Plato gave that desire a name and a location and a story. And once he did that, nobody could take it back. The Atlantis that emerged from his two dialogues was not the Atlantis he wrote. It had been reshaped by every generation that touched it, given new powers, new technology, new spiritual significance, new racial meaning, new political purpose. It absorbed everything people needed it to be, which is why it survived when other ancient stories did not. The myths of dozens of ancient cultures are known only to specialists. The stories that shaped entire civilizations have been forgotten so completely that we cannot even recover their original forms. Atlantis is everywhere. Films, video games, novels, conspiracy theories, serious academic papers. It has been placed in the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, the Caribbean, the Sahara Desert, Antarctica, the North Sea, and the Aegean. It has been dated to 11,000 years ago, and to 50,000 years ago, and to 100,000 years ago. Every version contradicts every other version. None of them match what Plato actually wrote. Because Atlantis was never really about geography or history or archaeology, it was always about the same thing it was about when Plato invented it. What does a perfect society look like? What happens when it fails? And what does the failure tell us about ourselves? Those questions do not have answers that can be found at the bottom of the ocean. But people keep looking anyway. Because the alternative, accepting that there was no golden age, that humanity has always been exactly as complicated and flawed and occasionally magnificent as it is right now, is somehow less comforting than believing that somewhere beneath the waves, the ruins of something better are waiting to be found. Plato wrote one story. 2,000 years later, it is still doing exactly what he intended, making people think about what they have lost, even if they never had it in the first place.